Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on gender equity in the coffee value chain, organized by the Partnership on Gender Equity and Roast Magazine. My name is Aarti Ramchandran, and I will be your moderator today. I have the privilege of serving on PGE's board, and in my day job, I'm head of research and engagements at the FAIR Initiative, which is an investor network that focuses on sustainable food systems. Just a quick overview of our agenda. PGE's CEO and founder, Kimberly Eason, will help to set up and give us a quick context. And Nora Berkeley, who's research lead at PGE, will present an overview of the results of an investor survey that was conducted by PGE earlier this year, last year actually. We will then hear from our panelists today, Ewan Reed, Managing Director at Matthew Algae, Kelly Amoroso, who is a coffee buyer at Allegro Coffee, and Carlos Vargas, who is the General Manager at the Coop Terrazzo, a coffee producer co-op. Just a few quick housekeeping rules. We have more than 100 registered participants today, so just for the sake of efficiency, please type in your questions throughout the webinar. We will attempt to get to audience questions during our panel discussion later in the hour. And if we don't get to all questions, if we're not able to address all questions, certainly we'll make every attempt to respond to you in writing if that's possible. So I'd like to kick us off today by inviting Lily Kubota, who is the managing editor at Roast Magazine, to give us an overview of why she decided to focus on the issue of gender equity in the most recent issue of Roast Magazine. So over to you, Lily.
Thank you, Aarti. So when the Partnership for Gender Equity team, Nora and Kimberly, approached Roast to collaborate on a survey on gender equity and green buying last year, we thought it would be a great way to better understand our readership and to educate the industry on how others are tackling these challenges and to learn from each other and discover new approaches. We targeted companies that purchase coffee from importers, roasters, producer partners, focusing on whether or not they prioritize the issue of gender equity when making green buying decisions. But the survey didn't go into their internal hiring practices or other aspects of the business. The survey opened on Monday, July 15th with a deadline of August 15th to complete the form. So it ran for a month. It was distributed via email to a wide-ranging list of industry stakeholders, and the link was posted on social media through Roast and Partnership for Gender Equity channels. There was a total of 162 respondents. Once the survey period was over, Nora analyzed the raw data and penned an article to share the results of our findings. The data was presented in the January-February issue of Roast Magazine, which is available to read in full at roastmagazine.com. And in just a bit, she'll dig into the details of these responses, and we can take a look at the landscape of gender equity in coffee buying across the sector. For now, I'll turn the floor back over to our moderator, Aarti.
Thank you. Thanks, Lily. Yeah. Well, now I'd like to turn it over to Kimberly and Nora to present PG's work and the survey that Lily just referenced.
Thanks, Aarti. Thanks, Lily. And thanks for everyone for being here. The Partnership for Gender Equity has been working on this issue for about 5 years now, and it's clear from across many channels that gender equity is good for people and it's good for business. More than ever, we see evidence from across the board, not only from organizations like the UN and the World Bank, but then more academic institutions, development agencies, and of course, McKinsey has a very strong research arm focused solely on gender equity. And we know that gender equity is of course not just a women's issue, it's also a family issue, a community issue, a societal issue, and it is a business issue. And it's also a business opportunity, which we want to highlight today. I wanted also to point out there was a recent report, and the reason why I want to highlight this report from the International Union for Conservation of Nature, a UN agency, is that we want to look at gender equity not only as an important way to address risks, but also the opportunity. And Mary Robinson, former Prime Minister of Ireland, pointing out here in the introduction to that report that gender equality is a prerequisite to the collective effort needed to address the climate emergency. And with the many issues that the coffee sector has identified in terms of importance and priority for sustainability, climate is only one. And we also recognize that gender equity, there's an element of gender equity in all of the issues that we care about within the broader coffee sector. And fortunately, businesses are stepping up. A number of you may have heard that back in August, we have companies such as JAB and Keurig Dr. Pepper, who signed on to the OECD Business for Inclusive Growth, focusing on equality in their supply chains. And other thought leader organizations, companies such as Lavazza and Starbucks, some of the big name brands, but also a number of smaller, medium-sized companies that have taken gender equity as a priority and have joined on to support our Equal Origins initiative. To highlight, not everybody on the call knows the Partnership for Gender Equity. As I said, we've existed about 5 years formally, born under the umbrella of the Coffee Quality Institute. It's really our role to conduct research to inform the business case. Why is this issue important for companies to invest in? We've been involved in field level projects with different development partners and business partners in Nicaragua, Ethiopia, and we're just getting ready to launch work in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've built a number of tools to catalyze action, one of which we'll be talking about more today, and really advocating and engaging across the sector, because we know that the industry voice is priority in making a shift with regards to gender equity possible across the sector. At the end of the webinar, I'll touch a little bit more on this, but the new tool was informed by a number of conversations that we've had across the sector. We've stepped up our work in the past year and a half to really understand, okay, how do we galvanize greater action towards gender equity? And what we heard is that companies really do want to see how can they integrate gender equity into their actual supply chain efforts, beyond investing in charitable contributions, which are of course important, development projects, which are of course important, but really complementing with how companies actually source coffee. So again, I will touch a bit more on this as we move forward. Gender equity is a market opportunity. More and more millennials, as you all well know, are savvy consumers and advocates, and they're demanding sustainability in their products as well as gender equity. So again, this also is an initiative that came out of the research that we conducted, again, thanks to Roast, and I'll turn it over to Nora to talk through a bit about the findings, and then we'll pick it up with our panel conversation. So thanks, Nora, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Kimberly. And just to reiterate, I thank everybody for being here. And Lily spoke a little bit to Roast's interest in this survey, and so I'll speak just a little bit to PGE's interest. As Kimberly mentioned, the Partnership for Gender Equity has been working on this issue for 5 years. So, you know, why 5 years later do a survey? And I think it was really to generate more understanding about specifically purchasing practices, gender equity as a strategy in procurement, and you know, the actual measurement that was being used, to really understand what were the gaps and the opportunities. And we've of course had many conversations with companies about the importance of gender equity to them, but through a survey we were able to speak to a much larger audience and really understand the data behind how focused companies were on gender equity in their buying strategies and in measurement strategies, and where was there room to grow. And from that, the idea was to be able to understand, well, where could PGE support and build support for those companies, as well as, you know, encourage more gender equity throughout the sector, based on some data from more companies that maybe we hadn't spoken to yet. So if we can move on to the next slide here, I'll show some of the findings, and these are again available in the full report and the full article that you can access through Roast Magazine. But one of the biggest questions we asked was whether or not companies were simply asking their suppliers of origin if they have gender programs. So you can see here that some were unsure. The majority were not asking the question, but about 30% were. Next one. And then the same was true here for whether or not the company has a gender strategy. but a little bit less. There was about maybe 30% were asking questions about whether or not their suppliers had gender programs, and about 20% here actually said yes for whether or not they had a gender strategy. So to us, it was clear that simply asking the question was happening more often than companies could actually identify whether those questions were part of a more concrete and clear strategy. However, you see here that if suppliers have a demonstrated commitment to gender equity, we asked companies whether or not this would have an influence on whether or not they would choose to buy from them. And this was the sort of simple yes or no answer, and you can see that while companies are not necessarily always asking the question, if they had access to the information, then it would influence their buying practices. And through some of the written responses, the people were saying, well, if all things are equal, so if we can ensure that there's quality, of course, of the coffee, if all else is equal, then yes, having a commitment to gender equity would encourage us to buy from one supplier over another. And then this was a little bit similar to the questions about gender equity, gender programs. We also asked if companies were asking their suppliers if they reported on gender or had any gender indicators that they regularly reported on. And this was a little bit less. Not as many people were asking specifically about these numbers than whether or not companies or suppliers were focusing in general on gender. But again, you see that although not as great as just a general focus on gender equity, companies did say that they would be more encouraged to buy from suppliers if they had access to those numbers and those indicators. So you can see here that the yes answers to this are higher than the number of people who are currently asking about gender indicators. And then this is the final graph that we'll show, I believe. Hopefully there's maybe one more, but this is like the last one. And the question was, in supply chain investments, are companies investing in sustainability programs where gender is the primary focus? And so this was about 13% here. But then when we asked a similar question, which was whether or not companies were working on gender at all in their investments, or excuse me, if they had in their investment programs, if there was any aspect of gender that was sort of a part of it, the answer was the same. So basically what we came away with was that the primary investments in gender was the main focus, and companies were not aware of gender as being integrated into their other investments. So we saw that there was an opportunity for gender to be both the primary focus of investment as well as integrated into other investments. And that is probably happening, but it shows that companies are perhaps unaware of how gender is integrated into their other investments or how it could be integrated into their other investments. Great, so that was the last one. So what does that all mean? I gave away, I think, some things that I think were meaningful about that data. And again, we have more in the actual article. But for me, what this all means is that, about 30% at present of buyers are asking questions of their suppliers. But it doesn't constitute necessarily a clear strategy as part of their purchasing. So there's certainly room to make this more strategic throughout buying companies. And there's also a lot of room to grow in terms of making use of data. A lot of companies we've spoken to over the past several years have said that what would be beneficial for them, or what would give them that push to focus more on gender equity would be data. And so at present, companies are not asking their suppliers about this, but that doesn't mean they don't have the information to share. And so again, the idea of that gender equity can be incorporated into existing investments. So gender doesn't have to be and should not be a standalone program that you focus on. Gender can be integrated into all your investments. And so there's a lot of room to understand where that is happening with current investments, or where it could be incorporated. And another aspect that came out of this data, oh, if you could go back, thanks, is there was concern about, while it clearly demonstrated that if suppliers are able to show that they are focusing on gender equity or have the data to back it up, this does show that it could be greater market access for them. There was a somewhat of a sensitivity around creating rules or stipulations in contracts that would require suppliers in some capacity to focus on gender. So the idea is, both suppliers and buyers wanted to move away from this rule-based approach and more of an opportunity approach. So if you can share information and talk freely and openly in a data-driven way about gender, that yes, it could improve market access, but not in a rule-based manner. So now we can move on to the next one. And so just some additional thoughts that we share throughout the article and have some data on, if you read that, when and if, or if you have read that more closely, is that buyers really acknowledge that long-term relationships were key. So about 40% of respondents said that they are finding that their longer-term suppliers are focusing more on gender equity. So that stability of the supplier has a relationship to their ability to focus on this issue. And I also think that there's room to grow on both sides. It was 31% of companies had an internal gender strategy, and 21% had a gender strategy for purchasing. So not only is there room to grow with your supplier, but also as kind of internally for the company. And all respondents in a lot of their written answers did acknowledge that sort of discussion can really help build these bridges and create alliances between buyer and seller. It's again, moving away from that kind of rule-based approach and more about discussion for opportunity and how together you can impact your investment, make it have a greater impact with a focus on gender equity. And ultimately, buyers and sellers can learn from each other on building their sort of supplier-buyer relationship and incorporating gender into that, as well as their internal strategies. So I'll turn it back to Arti, and thank you all for listening to the data.
Great, thank you, Kimberly and Nora. And just a reminder to our participants that you can start typing in your questions at any time. So please do send through your questions. I'd like to now start the panel discussion, but before we do, it'd be great to hear from our three panelists about how they're looking at this issue within the context of their own organizations. So maybe Ian, you can kick us off.
Thanks, Arti. Yeah, I mean, I think for us, really resonates the words that came from Kimberly earlier on at the start there, where we were looking at gender as an opportunity within the organization. And some of that is driven by it being the right thing to do. And other elements were driven by work that we've been doing in partnership with long-term producer partners, whether that be in Africa, in Asia, and also in Latin America, around climate change adaptation. And increasingly, we found that we needed a more nuanced approach to this. And this is something that really we've seen in the last 10 years, where we needed to be engaging in order to get traction on sustainable agriculture and on quality. We needed to be engaging on gender equity, because that was part of the toolkit. That was about part of the societal and organizational change that was needed. And also key to that, we've also found, looking at the next generation of farmers, was youth as well. And really, without gender equity, it's extremely difficult to engage with youth at the same time. So really, that's been the kind of groundswell that's sat in behind our organization as we've approached this over the last few years.
Great, thank you. Kelly? I think, Kelly, you're still on mute.
Thank you. So here at Allegro, we have several long-term relationships that we've been buying from that are actually managed by women farmers in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and then of course Christy Thorns is our sourcing director. She's been in the industry for a very long time and helping to maintain and encourage gender equity in our supply chain, along with our sustainability practices. In particular, through our responsible sourcing initiative that we started about 2 or 3 years ago, really capturing the data and asking our supply chains, what are you doing about gender equity within your organization, or if you have certain programs. And then we've also, in different ways, have been able to bring those coffees to market. So we have our Cafe La Dueña coffee that is produced by women coffee farmers. It's a blend of various countries. And then last year we did our Three Queens blend, which was also a donation to the Partnership for Gender Equity, of a blend of East African coffees. And then most recently, and I think this is the best example of where really touching in on how quality is still the primary focus for us, but this has actually been a partnership with a women's group in Brazil. It's our small batch Matau honey program that we've done with a group of 24 women farmers, where this was brought to us by one of our partners in Brazil, and they were working with these women farmers who had presented some lots to Cup of Excellence that won. And then from then forward, we're looking to how they could do quality improvements in their farming techniques. And we captured this with our partner there in Brazil, and we're able to fund now some parabolic dryers so that they can produce these naturals for us and are receiving a better premium for it. I think one of the things that we've learned along the way is, we definitely encourage it. We ask these questions so that our supply chains know that we are interested in this, and we're being very mindful of not forcing it on them. We want to be very aware of the fact that this is something that has to be a partnership. It needs to be something that if they're interested, we want to encourage that and capture any opportunities that they see within their organization. So that's, we're learning along the way, but it's something that we definitely have a focus on within our buying practices.
Great, thank you, Kelly. And Carlos? Carlos, I think you're on mute as well.
Hello, it's my pleasure to be here with all of you. I would like to share a little bit about our experience at Copa Tarazu. We are 5,000 co-op members, and about a third of that number of members are women. So it's a large amount of women that are members of this co-op. But what we have seen in the past is that only about 50% of those women really participate in the co-op. They are assisting to the meetings, to the activities, to training, and then maybe just 10% of the members of the board of directors and committees are women. So we are lacking much more participation. We need much more participation of women. What we have done in the last maybe 2-3 years, and it's mainly because here in Costa Rica, there's a large discussion about gender equity. It's not because we are receiving asking from our buyers. It's mainly because internal discussion. We have been starting to develop activities to empower women, to train them, to get more participation from the women. And that, I will say that we are just starting in this process. We are seeing a very large interest from women to participate. But I would like just to really clarify that's because of the internal situation of Costa Rica, because we are a very large organization located in the Tarazu region. So we are very exposed to the local, the regional and national discussions. And that's why we are involved in these activities to generate more participation of women in all this process.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. So I guess, my first question, and perhaps part of this is because, I'm looking at it from a slightly different perspective, and my expertise is not particularly coffee. But I think I'd like to get a sense of what we really mean when we say gender equity, really at the basic level. What is it that actually constitutes? And I'll pose this to all the panelists, but maybe Kelly, I'll look at you and you can kick us off.
So what does gender equity mean for us in our buying practices? I would say we're asking the questions. We're creating a dialogue with our supply chains. We have some supply chains that we've been working with for over 20 years. And in those cases, we are supporting any of the women farmers that are in leadership positions. Either they are the farm owner, both small and large, or we have found that the cooperative or the organization has posted women in leadership positions. That is something that we definitely, these are more examples, I would say, of how we view gender equity. And then in new supply chains, it really is helping them to understand that that is something that we would be supportive of if we learn that that is of interest for them. And creating opportunities for women to have the same access to training or credit or fertilizers. And if there is an opportunity for us to be able to evaluate a coffee that is sourced by women, then there could be a home for that coffee within our lines and within our different blends.
Yes, I could add, RT, I think the word you used, Kelly, access is really important. And it's not about treating everybody, equity, I think, to me, is not about treating everyone the exact same or making sure kind of that everyone is equal, because I think that's a too basic understanding of equity in the value chain. It's about understanding that there are barriers to equality of opportunity. And one of those barriers is, for example, being able to access financing. And you need to have land, or you need to be a member of a cooperative to access financing. And in every country, there's different reasons and policies and rules as to why women in producing countries might have less access to land and therefore less access to credit. So how can, through strategies of gender equity, we remove those barriers? And so the reason I say it's not about treating everyone equally is because in order to create equality of opportunity, you do have to recognize that women are different than men in that capacity and need more investment to remove those barriers. So it's about taking action. And I think something that Carlos mentioned, which is that these initiatives on their part didn't come from questions that buyers were asking. They came from internal discussions, which is something that came out that throughout so much of our work in the past several years. That was a common thread. And so through this webinar and through other efforts, I would really encourage all buyers who are not part of that 30% who are asking questions to start asking questions, because I think chances are you're going to find out that your suppliers are working on gender equity in some capacity and do have a strategy, and being able to work on that strategy together could only improve it. And so you think their buyers would have a lot to learn from suppliers as well, especially because in each country the strategy does have to be different somewhat, or potentially. And the last thing I would say is, strategies range from women's coffee. That's certainly a part of it. But there are other strategies in gender equity trainings with men and women, masculinities training, incorporating youth into the discussion. So women's coffee is definitely one part of it. And there's also more that cooperatives are doing and suppliers are doing.
Great, thank you. Any further thoughts on? I mean, so what I've heard from Kelly and Nora is, one is obviously, equity is about making sure more women in leadership positions, and the second is around access and basically access to credit and financing and markets. Any further thoughts on how how buyers and companies can begin to start really getting a sense of what gender equity looks like?
I will say that, just adding to gender equity should be about more participation of women in all the process, have more opportunities and have access to key services like Nora was saying, credit, training. That's very important those are key activities to empower women to participate much more in all the process in the organizations.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, I mean, what we've heard right now is, clearly there is a growing and broad recognition of the fact that gender equity is linked to better productivity. Also, it seems like buyers from Nora's survey, like buyers are looking at this issue. They clearly recognize the importance of it. But there still seems to be the lack of a strategic approach to it, really. Many of them not asking the right questions or not even sort of digging deep into their supply chains to see how they can adopt a more strategic approach. And one of the things that you all mentioned, and I think really was the idea that this shouldn't be a top-down approach. It really is about opportunity. So I guess I'd like to sort of question that a little bit. I mean, will this improve the situation if buyers began to have a more top-down approach, or is that still something you think is going to be less useful in this context?
I think, Artie, you need to live by example to some extent in this. I remember standing in a cooperative meeting in Peru about 10 years ago, and I met with the CODEMU, the Women's Committee there. And about the second question I took from them at the end of their session after they had presented to me was, what are you doing in your organization? Meaning, what were methodologies as a business doing within our company back in the UK and Ireland to drive gender? So I think it's about walking the walk, and in addition to talking the talk in this area. So I think we have an obligation, if you're going to engage with producers and start to build a dialogue and a series of requirements within your supply chain, you have an obligation to do it back home as well, and to demonstrate that tangibly to your supply chain partners in order to be credible. I think the other piece is around the top-down element. For me, I think where I've seen some of the biggest changes and most impactful changes has actually been when it's been from the household out. So I think starting within the household and using tools such as GALS or Gender Action Learning System, that's where we've seen an opportunity to fast track the agenda on gender sometimes in cultures that are actually quite conservative when it comes to gender. We've been able to see some rapid changes. For instance, with our producer group we work with in southern Peru called San Juan del Oro, within a 3-year period, they went from having only 3 producer members, female members in positions of leadership, to 31 within a relatively short time scale. And if that came from the work that was done in the household, that change happened at roots level within that community. I think if that had been a top-down approach coming from buyers or even coming from the cooperative itself, I think you never have had that speed of change there.
And sorry, just to explain that to your audience a little bit. So when you say the GALS tool, is that something, I mean, could you expand on that exactly? What you mean by within the household? Yeah,
so there are members of Kimberly in particular who's got more experience of this than myself, but essentially GALS is a visual tool that can be utilized within communities, and essentially it's an inclusive tool, so that it looks to really to get the household to work cohesively on gender. Quite often a visual tool is used to map an action journey. So it might look at the state of the household where it is on year 1 and where they want that to be in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And it can be, gender is one component of that, but you might also be looking at income diversification. You might also be looking at sustainable agricultural outcomes for the farm, and is very much looking at the farm as a micro business. I'm looking at the role of the family within that business, and then looking at the role of gender within that. And as part of that, it's also starting to look at the wider community, whether it's in neighbouring farms or within the cooperative itself, if it's in a co-op context.
Great.
Yeah, and just to build on what Ewan was saying about the Gender Action Learning System, it really is a household-based methodology that focuses on male and female farmers of diverse ages, but really working with them to develop critical thinking skills about how do they achieve a vision for their future, when oftentimes farmers don't necessarily have the opportunity to look more than a day ahead, planning for a day or a week ahead. And so the idea is really to step back and to create a broader vision for what it is they want to achieve on their farms, but also within their household, and with some very innovative and fun and creative tools to help tease out the pathway to achieve their vision. And that includes an analysis of what happens at the household level and the community level in terms of decision making, access to resources and assets, and then how households actually work, really looking at potentially, how to optimize decision making and optimize the working relationship within the family so that productive outcomes improve and also household outcomes improve. And we tie that up into work along with farmer organizations, but also to this link to the market, because one of the things that we have heard, and to underscore, is that when farmer organizations hear from their buyers, and again, not necessarily in this top-down approach, but as an opportunity and as a question, what are you doing with regards to gender equity? It really does encourage them to take the issue more seriously and to take action.
Thank you. And is that something, Kimberly, I mean, GALS is something that you all, PGE does help with that, right? With helping companies understand how to implement some of that.
Yes, and we've had companies. Allegro supported one of our workshops in Guatemala, and we have ongoing opportunities to also conduct workshops all over the world.
Right. Well, I mean, so you all mentioned, I mean, at the household level, and again, access and the dynamics within the household. And I mean, we have one question today, really talking about, and Carlos, this is for you, essentially what the specific barriers are that exist for low participation. Is it because, they don't have access to training, childcare, they don't own vehicles, they have to go into to meetings where the crowd is primarily male? Are these some of the big barriers that exist for women at the micro level?
Yeah, it's more a cultural situation that in the agriculture, what is more common is that the man is the one that represents the activity. In this case, coffee is the one that represents the farm at the co-op level, at the milling, and is the one that goes to the meetings. And normally the woman is taking care of the house chores and is very busy on that side. So it's more a cultural situation that the women stay more at home and are so visible at the outside of the house or the farm. What we are seeing here is as we get younger women to join the co-op, that's
Did we lose Carlos?
Yeah.
Looks like there might be a connection.
Yeah.
Oh.
There you are.
Okay, so I will say that the barriers is made a cultural barrier. The role of the woman at the family makes that she stay much more at home and hasn't had much less time to go to meetings, to participate on training or
Great. Looks like we've lost Carlos again. Oh.
Hello.
I mean, and that's very helpful, Carlos. And maybe, I mean, just very quickly, I want to make sure that, I mean, and so Kimberly, when you talk about the GALS household tool, I mean, this addresses some of the barriers that, the cultural barriers that Carlos was just referencing, right?
Yeah, just to highlight, Ewan had even pointed out that after having some of the household methodologies trainings and some of the organizations they work with in southern Peru, that you can see this, there's almost like a demonstration effect of when households and families start to work together differently because of new perspectives and new ideas about gender that are different than the typical cultural paradigm that they've been operating in for many years. It can really have this catalytic effect within the community that can then ripple up into the producer organization as well. And so the way we look at, kind of our approach is you have to connect with the market, connect with the farmer organizations, and specifically this work at the household level is key to create sort of a virtuous circle of positive impact towards meeting the needs of everyone up and down the supply chain, especially starting at the smallholder household level.
Yeah, great. I mean, I want to sort of, slightly pivot the conversation around, because one thing that Ewan mentioned actually in his remarks was, of course, I mean, one of the big drivers is, of course, around climate change and the impact that this is going to have on coffee supply chains. So, I mean, what is it? I mean, can you expand on that, Ewan? And, I'd invite the other panelists to weigh in as well. What is it that, I mean, why is gender so important from the context of building resiliency to climate change impacts?
Again, I would agree with some of Carlos's comments. So I think it's about having a broader representation within the organization, being able to get access to training. And female inclusion is absolutely critical in that. And also, I think it gets back to this point around considering the farm as a micro business. So if you look at the topic of food security, if you look at the opportunities around crop diversification, if you look at farm management around shade management and around encouraging biodiversity on farms, these are things that require a more complex approach to farming to some extent, and a more technical approach to farming, albeit one that is showing empathy to the environment in where the farm is. And again, this is, it's requiring a fast track approach within farming organizations in order to get producers the knowledge that they need to operate in that way. And I think we also know through working with our producer partners that one of the most important thing around climate change adaptation strategies is that they're local. They need to be localized for individual farms. They need to be localized for the landscape of that farm is. And again, that in order to develop those solutions, that needs inclusion from without the community, and females are key to driving innovation and adoption of practices in these farms.
And I mean, when you say practices, I mean, exactly what does that mean?
I mean, it could be something as very simple in terms of how drainage is managed on a farm, how contouring is done on the farm. It could be how water is managed within the household, and the integration, again, thinking as the farm starting within the house. So how are we managing capturing of rainwater for either for irrigating of crops to allow for food security at different times of the year, or increasingly for irrigating of the coffee crop itself. So, I think these practices start in the household and go out to the farm and then go out into the wider community. That's really the message.
And Kelly, any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it goes back to the having a sustainable supply chain. You have women, and it's just based on what the reports that we've seen, women in general seem to have a lot of influence on what's happening on the farm, what's happening in the household, the sustainability of the farm, and all of the production. Those kinds of things are contribute to how they're going to manage climate change. How are they going to deal with, the rains coming earlier this year? Are they going to be able to handle that coffee picking on their own as a family, or will they need to get support and help? So I think it contributes to the bigger picture of a sustainable supply chain. And what we've seen and what's been demonstrated is the more that you have women involved in that, the more stable it is, and how they can respond to those climate changes, or how they can respond to those interruptions.
Artie, if I could jump in here as well, I think to tie a lot of what we've been saying together, I'm hearing a lot about the kind of local approaches, and even down to the household, not just local to one community, country, or a producer organization, but even to the household level. I mean, we're hearing that it's so much of it is change happens kind of at the local level. When we think about sort of the top down, I think it's less about top down, it's more about coordination. What is the role of companies? What is the role of an organization like PGE? And I see here that, someone asked, how do we continue to expand participation? I think it is about being able to coordinate, because approaches are so local, and they're going to be different in that capacity. but there's going to be, ways we can share information and learn from each other. And I think at present, what I saw from the results of the survey is there is still a lot of, there's a lack of awareness and information about what's going on, what are the right questions to ask. There's a fear of, asking about, women, or, it seems like it's going to, we favor one, gender over the other. And so there's a lack of information about how to go about this. And so when I think about the, quote unquote, top-down role, it's more about supply chain coordination, sharing information across borders, and sharing those local approaches and, strategies to ensure that more solutions, come from kind of the ground up. And so, I think to the question here about whether or not, are we seeing this happen as organizations are getting more sophisticated? Are people being more attracted? I think companies and stakeholders are becoming more attracted when they see that there's, it can create change, whether or not there's greater market access, whether or not they're seeing they're more climate resilient. But the more that there's access to that information and strategies are being adopted or tried, people will see the impact. And we have to remember, going back to the question of the gender doesn't happen on its own. There's a lot of programs that are working on supporting cooperative development and sophistication. And so as gender is incorporated into that, there's an even greater impact. So to expand participation, I think it's sharing information, coordinating with one another, and ensuring gender is incorporated into just about anything we do, because we'll see a greater impact when we do that.
Good, thank you. I guess I have a question now for all the panelists. I mean, when talking about climate change, and one of the things that we discussed earlier was, the fact that climate change, and one of the impacts of climate change will be an increase in gender-based violence. And that sort of ties into a broader issue that, where, today there's a lot of discussion about workplaces and how there are some structural barriers, certainly, sort of emphasized by the Me Too movement. Is this, given the amount of attention we've seen to the issue of some of these structural barriers in corporate workplaces, is that discussion, do you think, percolating down to the supply chain level? Is Me Too an issue that any of you have seen sort of really pop up at the supply chain level?
I would say that in the coffee industry, the reality is that most of the coffee buyers right now, they take care mainly about quality, mainly about prices, and maybe more focus on environment and traceability, labor, but not on gender equity. So that's what we see that the buyers ask from us is, what's your quality, what's your price, do you have traceability, do you take care of the environment, and that's it. And then and most of those, like environment and traceability, labor conditions are required by certifications, and so when a buyer asks for a certification, they know that those requirements are there in certification, though they expect that we comply with all of that. But no one is asking, almost no one is asking about gender equity. That's what we see. That's the reality that we see right now. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we source a lot of coffee through certified supply chains, and I think one of the challenges is there that fair trade for many years now has had a requirement for there to be a gender program and within producer organizations, but it's not an impact-based assessment around that program. It's enough for the program to exist. It's enough for the program to be able to demonstrate some activity, but there's not really a requirement there to measure impact over time. And I draw into similar comparisons. If you look at child labor, for instance, an auditor will go into an operation and look and see if they see any evidence of child labor. They'll look at age documentation checkings or whatever, depends on local context. But you know, a really good measure for impact on that is around looking at school inclusion and actually seeing how many kids have access to school, what those take-up rates are, and that is actually a far more powerful measure by proxy of lack of child labour than looking on farms by doing spot audits. So I guess it's actually looking for some of these more nuanced, more intelligent indicators, and actually looking for impact and not just I think lip service to programs is probably a big step that we need to take forward.
Great, thank you.
I have just one comment on that, just an example that I'm familiar with in one of our Uganda supply chains. And there was definitely some, based on, again, this is where, you know, the partnership and really understanding your partner and having the trust and confidence that they are able to execute this in a way that doesn't do any damage to the community and to the women in the organization or in the community where they're sourcing from. There was definitely some pushback and from the women saying, hey, I really want to be a part of this program, but I can't let it creates problems for me in my household if you do it in a way that's really flashy and premium. You know, allowing me to get more money is great, but let's do it quietly, was the response that we got from him when we were asking him about it. When he started to make a big roar about it, or when he started to encourage it more and talk about it more and broadcast it more, it created problems for the women. So then they were like, hey, we want to participate, but we need to do it in a way that we can be successful within our household and it doesn't create problems for us. So it is a very sensitive issue, and that was in Uganda. So it's an East Africa geographical region. I think the cultural approach is really important to understand how you can execute these programs in a very cultural sensitive way that does not create problems in the household.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, Gail, I think that local context is very important. But I have another example that's the opposite end of the scale, and it's a producer group in Indonesia and Sumatra where they were trying over time to get a positive gender program running within the cooperative organization, and actually said they made the decision that for speed and to get impact was actually to start a separate women's cooperative. And I asked them why they decided to do that, and they said, because if we tried to make the change within the existing cooperative structure, it would have taken us about 10 years to get to the same point. So I think sometimes we need to see innovation, but I agree completely. It needs to be under a local context.
Great. Well, I mean, I'd like to now, I mean, we've received a few audience questions, so just maybe moving on to some of that. I mean, I think one thing that that is of interest is what type of data is most useful and actionable. And I think, I mean, what would be helpful is, I think if we could go around the room and if each of you could talk about one indicator, what do you think is the most important indicator for a company to actually measure when talking about gender equity? And maybe I'll start with you, Kimberly.
Yeah, I mean, I think one question is what's the most important in terms of actually getting impact, but then the other is what's feasible, right? What are pharma organizations already measuring? And that, I think, is the biggest challenge, is that a lot of organizations are not collecting sex disaggregated data. So it is very difficult to get real figures that can help drive change. Right now, companies are looking a lot, you know, the easier things to track are participation in training programs, for example, where a lot of investment is made, making sure that there's at least equal participation of male and females in training programs, and that those training programs are made more accessible to female participants who typically are overburdened at home or are not able to participate because of cultural contexts.
Yeah, Nora?
Yes, I think, I mean, you know, Kimberly is going to speak about the Buyer-Seller Alliance, where we did kind of a lot of this research with buyers and suppliers about the kind of data that would be feasible and the most meaningful. And, you know, I think it really stems from, you know, specialty coffee is so much about relationships. And so I think part of it stems from what is it that buyers are really interested in and can share with their customers, what's meaningful to their customers. And so there is a lot of, you know, information and you know, support that PGE can provide about kind of what's the typical best practice around data. But I think some of the challenges come from a lot of that best practice is actually hard for suppliers, you know, to commonly report on that information. So, you know, again, you know, we can help with having those conversations with between buyers and suppliers, but I think that's, for me, would be the most meaningful thing, is kind of deciding together what's the data that you can collect and what would be most meaningful to both parties. And ultimately, if the conversations don't have to go on forever. This can be, you know, a relatively burden-free, you know, conversation. And so, you know, encouraging more companies and buyers and suppliers to do that is, I think, the next big focus of PGE's work.
Great. Ewan?
I think getting down to some financial fundamentals is really important. So I think whether that's around land ownership rights, and I'm very aware that some of these have local sensitivities and local cultural context as well, but I think being able to measure change over time in that area is really important, and also measurements that are based around female influence and female participation in financial decisions, both within the household, in the context of the farm, and in the context of a producer organization, if that's relevant as well.
Great. Carlos?
Yeah, I just to add, well, participation will be maybe one of the key factors to measure. Access to credit, access to training, it's also very, very important. And then also the participation at the leadership of the organization, in the case of producer organization, co-ops, or whatever. But the participation of women in the leadership, it would be key elements to measure.
Kelly?
All three of those. Yep. Access to credit, trading, if they're able to acquire more land or not, for in a women's situation, that the women has the title of land. And then, of course, within the household, leadership positions. And if there's some way to talk about, this is the most difficult to measure, but if there is some way to talk about how women have more opportunity in the decision making in the household, that would be wonderful.
Great. I mean, unfortunately, we're running out of time here. So I think, and there is a question about how to what extent new companies are and additional stakeholders are participating in gender equity programs. So perhaps, Kimberly, you can address that as part of your discussion around the framework. Just very quickly before we end, I wanted to quickly just summarize the discussion today, just so that there are some key takeaways, which is, when it comes to gender equity, we're talking about leadership, access to leadership, access to credit, financing, training. I think the consensus is that it can't be a top-down approach. Now Nora said, it has to be about sort of supply chain coordination, sharing information, and certainly one big issue is at the household level. How do you try and an approach from looking at it from a localized, maybe even at a household level. Another sort of, I think, key theme was certification. I mean, even if it is addressed through certification, it hasn't been an impact-based approach. So really having a more impact-based approach, even for and encouraging certifiers to take a more impact-based approach. I think one point that was discussed was culturally, it's very important to have a localized cultural sort of, an approach that takes into account sensitivities, but equally it's important to sort of push the envelope and have more innovation. And when it comes to data, participation in training programs, financial fundamentals, land ownership, and access to credit training and acquiring more land seems to be sort of some key areas that buyers can look at. So, well, thank you all again for your fantastic contribution. I hope this has been useful to our listeners, and I'll pass it on to Kimberly because I know there's some very exciting work that PG is doing.
Thank you, Artie. Thanks. Yeah, so I want to highlight that gender equity is a key lever for change. I think we've seen in many of the comments made by the panelists and from the data that we have a real opportunity to drive change by engaging in gender equity. And also that roasters really do have a voice. Roasters have a lot of leverage in the supply chain. When roasters speak, farmer organizations and other partners respond. And so over the past few months, we've been working with different partners, farmer organizations and roasters to really figure out how do we connect the dots on all of this work? How do we create a space for conversation, for better understanding, but doing so in a way that actually creates opportunity for impact and measurement of data. This is a chance to align with the United Nations has put forth their Decade for Change, Decade for Action. And so what we really want to do is call each of us on this call, not just roasters, not just buyers, but everyone that's engaged in work along the coffee supply chain and other supply chains, cocoa and tea as well, to look at how can we align our work with the achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the key outcomes of the work of the past, 5 years, but more specifically over the past year in many conversations has been to develop this, a buyer-supplier alliance so that we can, in a more concrete way, understand how our engagement can impact in a favorable way the opportunities that farmer organizations see to engage in gender equity. And the idea is that this links to a gender equity scorecard that farmer organizations, it's a voluntary self-assessment, it's not a certification, but it gives farmer organizations a framework within which to take action along a set of 5 criteria that have been informed by a number of other frameworks out there. And then tools, how can farmers, farmer organizations make progress along a framework for progress with tools and resources, and being able to share that best practice, understanding from also buyers what it is that they're looking for, and really strengthening the kinds of conversations that are taking place around this issue in the coffee sector in ways that start to really drive engagement and change. And so just, you know, want to invite all of the buyers. You'll be getting an email after this call. Invite all of the buyers to join up and get more information about why this is important and how it's working. We're bringing farmer organizations on board as we speak. And then also to, you know, investment and support with contributions really helps us to be able to drive this work forward. We see there's huge potential, huge interest. And so we have an opportunity to have everyone join the Equal Origins network and further engage in this effort so that we can all have really work towards a supply chain that works for everyone. And so with that, I just want to say thank you. Thanks to all of our panelists, Nora, Carlos, Ewan, Kelly, Lily, RT for your moderation, and to Roast Magazine for being our partner in getting the survey out there, all of the responses that we had to the survey from around the world, and all of you for choosing to spend this hour of your precious day with us. And you will get an email follow-up from us, so we would love to hear your thoughts in our survey, and then invitations for you all to participate moving forward. And also any questions we didn't get to, we'll get back to those as well. So thanks. Have a lovely rest of your day.